And Brando was famous for this. There are other kinds of actors like that. The other kinds of imaginative involvements that Hilgard discovered involve sensory stimulation, going out in nature and being absorbed in that. Professor Keltner here in the psychology department is now studying states of awe that are induced by, say, walking through Muir Woods or going out to the Point Reyes seashore or whatever. And that state of awe has many things in quality with this becoming imaginatively involved in very closely absorbed in these states of nature, or art or music or whatever. And then finally, Hilgard made this this discovery that there were people who became very absorbed in all sorts of physical adventures, not just going someplace to check off something on a bucket list, but really getting into visiting Istanbul or India or, for that matter, Chico, so that you're not just a tourist, you're actually getting very deeply involved in the environment, distinguishing between what she called physical space travelers, people who just go places, and mental state travelers, people who go places in their minds. Ronald Shore, another early investigator here, actually developed a concept of what he called the book reading fantasy, a state that people get into when they read various kinds of books. Again, not so much nonfiction, though sometimes narrative nonfiction, but especially fiction, where as they're reading the book, they experience themselves as if they're actually living the action in the book, taking on the role of one of the characters, being unable to put the book down, being kind of unable to tend to other things that go on, the kind of an obliviousness. If you've ever been absorbed in a book, or you've seen somebody who's absorbed in a book, you know that the rest of the world just kind of fades into the background. Not completely. You can respond to the events in the world if they're really important, if the fire alarm goes off or the kettle on the stove starts boiling over or whatever. You can deal with that. But for the rest of the time, you just let these other distractions kind of fade into the background. And again, return to Hilgard here for a second. She identified kind of two different kinds of involved readers, those that identify with characters and those that identify with the emotions that are being represented in the books. And in her clinical study, she went on to identify some of the characteristics of these involved readers. And the most important one, I think, is that becoming involved in reading is not just a process of being swept away. You have to involve yourself in the book and kind of allow yourself to be swept away by the book. Victor Nell, a South African psychologist, has developed this point more thoroughly, I think, where he talks about reading really as a mechanism for consciousness change, and talks about what he calls the world-creating power of books, whether they're fantasy books or just fiction, where when the reader reads the book, he's not just reading words on a page, but rather is stepping into or entering the world that is being created by the author. It has this concept, which I really like a lot, of ludic reading, from the term for play. These are people who read for fun, not just for business. And one characteristic of these ludic readers is that they'll report reading about a book a week of fiction or narrative nonfiction. They enjoy reading. They get precisely because they get very deeply involved in it. Now, one of the interesting things that happens is you see absorption everywhere when you start looking for it. You experience these. Most people in this room have had this experience. if not on a daily basis, at least very, very, very frequently. But this has, the state of absorption has gone almost completely unstudied in the experimental literature. We don't do studies in which we watch people become absorbed in their reading and then try to test them to see how absorbed they are. This is undiscovered the territory for psychologists. But we know that these kinds of things occur, and one domain in which we can see it is in acting. As I said before, there are some actors who are very skilled at portraying a role. There are other actors who get so deeply involved in the character that they're playing that they lose themselves. There's another example of restructuring yourself. When Marlon Brando played a character, he wasn't Marlon Brando anymore. He was the Godfather or Stanley Kowalski or something like that while he was engaged in this. Richard Burton, when he wasn't making movies just for money, had this kind of quality too. And it actually takes these people a while to snap out of their roles. They can't just, when the director says cut, they can't just stop. It takes them a while to do this. This is something that's described very well in Konstantin Stanislavski's books on the method in acting, for those of you who have any drama interests. A related state that has gotten a fair amount of attention more recently as kind of an offshoot of the development of what's known as positive psychology is a state known as flow, which has been described by Michael Csikszentmihalyi, depending on how Czech you are or Hungarian you are. But Csikszentmihalyi's concept of flow is very, very, very similar to Telegin's and Hilgard's and Shor's concept of absorption and imaginative involvement. He defines it as a state in which people are so involved in an activity that nothing else seems to matter. The experience is enjoyable, even if you're not particularly good at it, interestingly. And people will engage in this activity just for the sheer hell of it, without any kind of extrinsic motivation. Again, flow gets a lot of attention, but it's something that has not been studied much experimentally. And it would be interesting to try to develop paradigms in which people could kind of engage in some activity and enter into this flow state. Video gaming may have some of this kind of quality to it. My video gaming doesn't go beyond cribbage and backgammon, but probably everybody else in this room knows somebody who just kind of gets into the console, right, and you can't get them out of it, depending on what game they're playing. That's a domain where I think we might be able to study flow. Some athletes experience flow when they're running. Marathoners sometimes, about 2/3 of a way into the race, just about the time they're about to hit the wall, a good marathoner will often just kind of get so involved in the running that kind of forgets that he's running. It becomes almost as if the person is on automatic pilot. So here we are. Flow is defined very much like absorption is, as a focused state of consciousness. And here, Csikszentmihalyi argues that you enter flow when the demands of what you're doing and your skill at what you're doing are optimally matched. He argues you can't experience flow when you're not good at a task. It's an interesting prediction. When you're just learning, you're kind of going through the motions, and then you get very, very, very skilled, and you experience this flow. But interestingly, the prediction is that if your skill level is greater than what's required by the task, you're not going to experience flow either. So if you get some expert in some video game and you put him in a very simple version of it, he's not going to experience flow either. There's got to be this match, according to Csikszentmihalyi. But that's a hypothesis of his that, to my knowledge, has never really been tested. So again, flow is one of these is one of these states of consciousness that people can enter into all by themselves. Interestingly, in the background of flow is, again, for those of you who have taken a course in personality or maybe social psychology, the work of Abraham Maslow on human motivation. Maslow had this idea that at the top level of human motives, here we have kind of base human motives, physiological needs, safety needs, need for love, need for esteem. Maslow had this idea that once you got all those needs met, you still got a need, and that's a need for what Maslow called self-actualization, a feeling of kind of being alive and being free and all this kind of stuff associated with kind of 60s touchy-feely vocabulary, which still is with us in many ways. I don't mean to disparage it. What I mean to do is to locate it in kind of culture, in its cultural context. But Maslow argued that when people were self-actualized, they experienced this kind of flow as part and parcel of what Maslow called the peak experience, which you could have in lots of different domains. The experience of the object tends to be seen as a whole, as a complete unit, detached from relations, detached from possible usefulness, and so on. You're experiencing the thing in and of itself. The percept is exclusively and fully attended to. Again, this peak experience has this quality of absorption, as a result of which the person becomes disoriented in time and space, kind of forgets where he is, forgets what he's doing, and experiences a unity of consciousness, by which Maslow meant a unity of subject and object. You blur the boundaries between yourself and the thing that you're doing. Now, Maslow was not actually Maslow started out as an experimental psychologist. He trained at the University of Wisconsin doing work on monkeys with Harry Harlow. But Maslow himself didn't do any experimental work on this. And again, this is the kind of thing that, especially with our modern interest in positive psychology, is something that people might want to think about doing experimental work on. Maslow had just really no way of doing this except to kind of give people examples and then ask them to think about ecstatic moments in their lives, which you don't get all that often necessarily. But you can see kind of what he's getting at here. Moments of rapture, perhaps from being in love or from listening to music or suddenly being hit by a book or a painting, that kind of thing, swept away by sunsets or music. And Maslow himself really didn't get much further than trying to get verbal descriptions of what these states were like. And this is what he meant by unity of consciousness. So I don't want to pursue this anymore. On the other side of the spectrum, or so it might appear, is another state of consciousness encountered in the ordinary course of everyday living, known as daydreaming, okay, where your mind wanders off the task you're supposed to be engaged in and fastens itself on something else, some kind of internal goal